On September 19th, 2025, Variety reported that Amazon MGM Studios had purchased the rights to produce a live-action Teddy Ruxpin movie in conjunction with Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson's 7 Buck Productions. Grundo Gazette first reported on the possibility of a live-action Teddy Ruxpin movie all the way back in 2021, when the then-named DJ2 Entertainment, now Story Kitchen, announced they had obtained the rights to pitch a Teddy Ruxpin movie around Hollywood. Not much has been said about the development of the movie since then, and it's unknown if Amazon's attempt to bring Teddy to the big screen will ever actually come to fruition. Nevertheless, the very idea that someone is out there trying to revive Teddy for modern audiences begs several questions. Would a Teddy Ruxpin movie be a sequel to the cliffhanger that ended the animated series, or a fresh reboot? Would a live-action movie be something like the live-action ABC special, or closer to something like Disney's Christopher Robin, in which animated or computer-animated characters live alongside live actors? Or would it be something closer to Who Framed Roger Rabbit, in which both the live actors and their animated co-stars live in a completely fictionalized version of our world? Would the film reinvent Teddy Ruxpin for modern audiences? And does that reinvention come at the sacrifice of who Teddy is and how fans know and love him? Can Teddy still be Teddy in 2025? While it's impossible to know what kind of story Amazon is cooking up for the world's most famous Iliop's big screen debut, we may have an idea of where things are going. How, you ask? Well, it turns out that before DJ2 rebranded itself as Story Kitchen, they left a rather juicy breadcrumb in plain sight. On their former website existed a list of each property they had obtained the rights to shop around to prospective production studios. You'll recognize some, such as Sonic the Hedgehog and Tomb Raider, which premiered in theaters and on Netflix respectively to collectively positive reviews. We can even credit the Sonic the Hedgehog movie for rekindling interest in video game-based movies like the Super Mario Bros. Movie, which became the most successful video game film adaptation of all time. Amidst these high-profile blockbusters was Teddy Ruxpin, who received his own section with very little else to speak of. A quick blurb described the success of the talking toy in the 80s and 90s, but nothing was mentioned as far as the adaptation itself. And then suddenly we had a much clearer picture because DJ2 Entertainment actually left a link to their pitch deck for the film on their website. And before the site could disappear, we nabbed it for safekeeping. Before we dive in, it's important to discuss what a pitch deck is. The film industry is populated by two groups of people: those who create and the people who pay for that creation. In this example, we have writers and producers. Before he goes out to show his great idea to everyone in the hopes that someone will pay to make it a reality, the writer will create a pitch deck, a glorified PowerPoint presentation laying out his idea for his movie, who the target audience is, and what kind of tone the movie is attempting to strike. If the writer's movie is based on an established property, such as Sonic the Hedgehog or Tomb Raider, the pitch deck will also include information about the brand and convince the studio that there is an audience that will pay to watch it. After all, a producer won't want to spend millions of dollars to make a movie nobody wants to see. And that's what we were able to find on DJ2's website, their pitch deck for the proposed Teddy Ruxpin live-action movie. And we're going to break it down slide by slide. Now, before we get started, I need to make 3 things clear. 1, the pitch deck was publicly available on the internet. Grundo Gazette does not have any knowledge or access to confidential information regarding DJ2, Teddy Ruxpin, or Alchemy 2. 2, the pitch deck that was posted is dated as being from 2024, and a lot could have changed in the last year. Just because this is the pitch deck they had a year ago does not mean it's the same pitch deck they are pitching to Amazon. And 3, for legal reasons, we are going to put our custom Grundo Gazette border around the pitch deck slides. I know many of you don't like that and would rather have a clean copy of the content. But never fear, because you can find links directly to the pitch deck in the video description, as well as a link to the Internet Archive where the original page is stored. Feel free to download and follow along. The pitch deck is made up of 38 slides, including title slides and other fluff, if you'll forgive the pun. We're going to break these slides down into 3 parts, starting with, what is Teddy Ruxpin? The first several slides are what we as fans would consider the boring stuff, but I'm going to go over them anyway because it provides interesting insight into how these pitch decks work and what DJ2's intention was with the Teddy Ruxpin live action movie. The first slide is a basic overview of things that will be discussed in more detail later, but it gives us an idea of what DJ2 was planning. First, it's described as a, quote, 4-quadrant movie. For the uninitiated, 4-quadrant refers to the demographic the movie is intended for. In this case, it refers to the 4 major demographics: men under 25, women under 25, men over 25, and women over 25. Basically, if you're a human and breathing, they want you to enjoy this movie. It also gives us our first hint as to what the premise of the movie is by explaining that Teddy would travel from the land of Grundo to the, quote, mean streets of the American suburbs. As examples, they mention Paddington and Sonic the Hedgehog. If you've seen either of these movies, you now have an idea of what you could expect. The next few slides are simply the lyrics to the chorus of Come Dream With Me Tonight, set against the Teddy Ruxpin Lullabies artwork. This is likely intended to draw your audience into the right vibe that helps convey the tone of the movie you're pitching. You wouldn't want to blast rap music while pitching a story about Teddy Ruxpin. Although, as we'll see in a bit, maybe you do. So far, we're just setting the table. The real meat of the pitch is buried a little ways down, but be patient, we'll get there. Slides 7 and 8 begin to explain who and what Teddy is. Specifically, they want to remind the people they're pitching to that Teddy Ruxpin is a talking toy resembling a bear that was wildly popular in the 80s and 90s. They mention he was created by Ken Forsey, a former Disney Imagineer, with lore that was inspired by J.R.R. Tolkien and technology that operated on audio cassettes which allowed Teddy to move in sync with the sound or come alive. Slide 9 describes the financial success of the talking toy, and slides 10 and 11 explains that Teddy's success left a definitive mark on the children who enjoyed him and the society that rushed to stores to buy him. Slides 12 and 13 describe the success of the Teddy Ruxpin brand, how much product was available outside of just the toy, lunchboxes, coloring books, clothing, figures, puppets, and yes, the Adventures of Teddy Ruxpin animated series. Slide 14 explains that there have been 4 further incarnations of Teddy Ruxpin the Talking Toy since the initial release, with the most recent being Wicked Cool Toys Teddy Ruxpin. Finally, Slide 15 talks about the vibrant and enduring fan community that helps keep Teddy's spirit and stories alive while inspiring new stories and adventures for the people who remember him. Slide 16 mentions some of the more recent sightings of Teddy in the media, such as his guest spot on House of Gucci and Season 4 of Netflix's Stranger Things. But Vincent, I hear you saying, I know all this stuff. I watched a 9-part docuseries about it, so why does this matter? Because you and I know who Teddy is. We know about the toy, the TV show, the stories, the legacy, all of it. But for an executive, sitting in a boardroom, making 6 or 7 figures a year, they may not know what Teddy is. It's not enough to say, this talking teddy bear was very popular 40 years ago. It's not enough to say this talking teddy bear has a ton of deep characters and history in this land of Grundo. You have to convince that executive that there's enough of an audience out there in the world that is willing to spend their hard-earned money to see a movie about that talking teddy bear. Because that's the only way you're going to get that executive to spend tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars to make that movie. The entire point of these slides is to prove that Teddy Ruxpin is worth their time and money. So, now that we've established that Teddy Ruxpin has the potential to make money, we can move on to who is Teddy Ruxpin? Okay, says the producer, you got me. So who's this Teddy Ruxpin? What's he all about? The next section breaks down the main characters of the world of Teddy Ruxpin. Who are the heroes? Who are the villains? Where's the comic relief? Slides 17 and 18 begin the character breakdowns. First is our hero, Teddy. The slide makes one mistake here by suggesting that Rolonia is an island of Grundo, but we know Rolonia is, for all intents and purposes, a separate country altogether. Otherwise, the descriptions of Teddy's character are pretty accurate. His insistence on seeing the best in people, his sense, quote, of wonder about the world, and his overwhelming hope are hallmarks of who Teddy is. It even mentions that he's not a bear, but an Iliop. It's the last bullet point that doesn't sit right with me. Calling Teddy an, quote, outdated Boy Scout, and suggesting that's something they can, quote, have a lot of fun with in a modern adaptation. For me, this is a red flag. There's a temptation to liken Teddy to Winnie the Pooh. Part of Pooh's charm is his naivete that stems from his reputation as a bear of very little brain. It demonstrates the contrasts between childlike innocence and the more cynical, jaded realities of adulthood. When Pooh makes us laugh, it's not because we're laughing at him, but laughing at ourselves in recollection of the children we used to be. But Teddy Ruxpin is not a child. He is not simple. Canonically, by the time we meet him, he's at least 15 years old. He's seen enough of the world to recognize the danger in it. It's not naivete that makes Teddy who he is. Teddy Ruxpin is special because he dares to hope in the genuine goodness of the world despite the dangers it can pose. And it's this hope that reminds us to hope in ourselves and in each other. I have no desire to see Teddy paraded around as the cute butt of every joke. It's Teddy's job to show us how to believe again, not our job to make Teddy look silly because we as adults know better. This fundamental misinterpretation makes me wary of how Teddy would be portrayed in this adaptation. But maybe I'm just being paranoid and reading too much into what is essentially a condensed character portrait. So let's move on. Next up, we have Grubby, who is somehow credited with hailing from, quote, his home county of Octagon. I'm not sure if they meant country, but either way, I have never heard of this in any of the lore up to this point. Even if Octagon were a real place, canonically, Grubby grew up in Rolonia, same as Teddy. It's possible the writers were trying to establish a new realm they could explore in future adaptations, so I'll give them a pass on that one. Again, the rest of the description of Grubby is pretty spot on. Let's look at Gimmick. The slide mentions that Gimmick is a Purloon, which, for our purposes, are the closest thing to humans in the land of Grundo. It's mentioned that Gimmick carries a multitude of tools on him at any given time, and suggests that he can produce, quote, the right implement for any situation. Again, I'm going to attribute this to a fundamental misunderstanding of the character. Gimmick was not a genius because he carried a veritable Batman utility belt full of countless tools. Gimmick's genius derives from his ability to MacGyver together the right solution from the resources at his disposal. At most, Gimmick generally has a writing pad, a pencil, a monkey wrench, a magnifying glass, and a screwdriver. He's not carrying a mystery mouse tool in his apron. Tweeg and LB are on the next slide, and again, the descriptions are fairly accurate. They do mention that Tweeg lives in his tower and nobody knows where the tower came from. However, anyone who's even glanced at the Teddy Ruxpin Bible will know when it was constructed and how Tweeg came to dwell there. Finally, we have Queller, and it's interesting that the picture used for him is from the sizzle reel as found in Billy Tuma's docuseries and not a picture of him from the animated series. The slide does pay homage to a popular theory that beneath his cloak and cowl, Queller is yet another Iliop. Again, there's nothing totally out of place here. The slide mentions that in this adaptation, Queller would pose a serious threat to our Earth, though I'm not sure how he would do that. Slide 21 is a wonderful acknowledgement of the fact that the world of Teddy Ruxpin is populated by an untold number of interesting, full-fledged characters, any of whom could be integrated into the story and add new depth and intrigue. This is a prudent nod to the imagination of Ken and his team of alchemists who each brought a different side of themselves to the land of Grundo. We can see a clear appreciation for this in the next couple of slides, where the writers highlight the extensive lore of the world of Teddy Ruxpin. They show the map of Grundo and explain that for all the simplicity of the storybooks and cassettes, there is a world of untapped potential behind each page. What follows next is largely a regurgitation of the history of Grundo as depicted in the Teddy Ruxpin Bible, though much of it is, again, related poorly. From a meteorite hitting the planet to the Iliops fleeing to the hard-to-find city, this all checks out. Unfortunately, it's once we get here that cracks in the facade begin to show. Slide 25 describes the Iliops as inventing, quote, 7 powerful paracausal crystals. The term paracausal appears to come from the video game franchise Destiny and essentially means magic, or a force outside of our understanding. I guess using a 4-syllable word to say magic sounds much more impressive. We then get a description of some of the crystal's powers, such as generating oxygen, invisibility, flight, and, quote, the ability to erase or alter memory. And again, I have to point out that the 7th crystal does not alter memory. It has the power to record, erase, and subsequently restore memory, but it cannot alter the things that are remembered. Slide 26 describes the Gatangs driving the Iliops out of the hard-to-find city in a, quote, fleet of airships, even though we know they were simply airplanes or flying machines. The breaking of the medallion, and the flight to Rolonia. I should point out here that they claim Teddy's ancestor was Theodore Ruskin, though I can't tell if that's a simple typo that nobody thought to correct. On slide 27, we finally get introduced to Teddy's role in this story and his quest for the, quote, power crystals, as they're now being called. My biggest issue here is that nowhere is the treasure of Grundo mentioned. That is what drove Teddy to venture to Grundo. He had no idea the crystals even existed until he discovered them in the shrine in the hard-to-find city. Teddy was out to seek adventure, not to rediscover his lineage or the history of the crystals. I know it sounds like I'm being nitpicky when I point these things out, but the fact is, if you're going to claim that you are in tune with an entire legion of Teddy Ruxpin fans who are clamoring to see him in a new story, you cannot then go about misrepresenting some of the most foundational aspects of his lore. It's possible these are all liberties being taken in an attempt to reboot the franchise, but it also has the potential to undermine the dedication of fans who have clung to these stories for most of their lives. Which brings us to the third and final part of this pitch deck. What's it about? Here it is, folks. The moment you've all been waiting for. This is where we get our clearest look at what was being planned for this adaptation. 2 questions are answered here. 1. The movie would be a combination of live action and computer animation, with Teddy and his friends alongside real-life actors. And 2, this would not be a sequel to the animated series. The slide goes on to suggest that the adaptation would be a G or PG affair, but with, quote, a modern satirical edge, and some, quote, slightly edgy, more adult comedy, to appeal to, quote, older cinema goers. This isn't just a red flag for me, this is a blaring alarm. The next slide adds that there should be a tinge of, quote, cynical self-awareness, that they, quote, should not be afraid to poke fun at themselves. So far we're pretty light on plot, but I bet you can imagine the kind of movie we're talking about here. Slide 31 suggests there would be scenes that take place exclusively in Grundo, and that these would be fully computer generated. And I have to be honest, so far, I'd much rather watch 90 minutes of that than whatever the rest of this turns out to be. Slide 32 is where we finally get our premise, the core of the story that will carry this film. The idea is that Ken Forsey, the inventor of Teddy Ruxpin, actually discovered Grundo. a real place, as his younger self, and when he returned to the real world, he used those stories and the friends he met as the basis for creating the character and subsequently the product of Teddy Ruxpin. Upon his final departure, the Grundonians give Ken yet another crystal for safekeeping. Somehow, the crystal ends up leaving Ken's possession. Meanwhile, in Grundo, Queller has, and I'm quoting verbatim here, 5 of the 6 original Iliop paracausal crystals, even though they acknowledged, just a few slides ago, that there are a total of 7 crystals. Teddy visits Earth and tracks down Ken only to find he's passed away, and the crystal he had is long gone. Teddy has to team up with Ken's family to find the missing crystal. Meanwhile, Queller sends Tweeg and LB to retrieve the crystal, but they keep coming up short, which leads the Supreme Oppressor to take matters into his own hands. Slide 34 stresses that the film would maintain Teddy's, quote, sense of wonder, positivity, and optimism, while in the same breath suggesting scenes in locations such as, quote, a biker bar, a monster truck rally, or a rap concert. Slide 35 finishes up the story. Teddy and our heroes return to Grundo with the missing crystal and must work together to stop Queller. Tweeg and LB have a, quote, momentary change of heart and assist Teddy and his friends in retrieving the other 5 crystals, returning them to the shrine in the Heart-to-Find City and finally defeating Queller. The lesson is that the villains, quote, have lost touch with their inner child, and Teddy uses the, quote, power of storytelling to bring them together again. Finally, we get the obligatory sequel bait, where Queller isn't actually defeated and will, inevitably, come back with a vengeance. Slide 36 is another typical Hollywood pitch deck staple, a showcase of movies or television shows with the same tone or structure as the movie they're pitching. In this case, we have Paddington 2, Sonic the Hedgehog 2, Chip 'n Dale Rescue Rangers, Detective Pikachu, the Brady Bunch movie, and even Ted Lasso. The last one is interesting because while it is a heartfelt story about a fish out of water growing into a family and learning to trust one another, it's also decidedly on the mature side, a clear nod to the writer's intent to explore some edgier commentary. Slide 37 thanks you for coming to their TED Talk, and Slide 38 is interesting if only because I have no idea where this quote from Ken Forsey came from, if it came from him at all. In helping to research the Ken Forsey docuseries with Billy Tuma, neither of us ever came across this quote, so I'm suspicious of its origins. Did they make it up? Or is there more to Ken's life and legacy that was intentionally withheld? So, what do you think? First, I want to applaud the writers for at least attempting to maintain Teddy's character despite clearly desiring to reboot him for contemporary audiences. It's clear that they understand who Teddy is, even if they fail to truly grasp the lore behind him. I could pick apart the plot points, such as whether or not Teddy gave Ken the 7th crystal or designed a new one altogether that he passed on to Ken. I also have to question why Ken, in this story, would ever allow that crystal out of his sight, much less give it away to someone else. Are there 8 crystals now? There's also the issue of Ken reappropriating Teddy and his friends' adventures for his own personal gain. I realize the movie would likely portray this as a loving tribute by Ken in immortalizing his trips to Grundo, but there's also a version where it feels like Ken comes off as a complete hack, harvesting Teddy and his world to further his own success. It could almost make Ken the villain of the story. It's also clear that setting the story in modern-day America is done for 2 reasons. 1, to capitalize on the wave of 80s nostalgia, which really is the entire point of this film in the first place, and 2, to keep the budget low. After all, you don't have to spend a lot of money to create an American biker bar, monster truck rally, or rap concert. But the bottom line is this. The story feels lazy, disingenuous, and forgettable. For all the talk about making this Teddy's triumphant return, this story sparks nothing of the imagination and adventure he is known for. And while it's hard to tell if this is in fact the movie Amazon is setting out to make, the reality is that it will likely not attract attention beyond the most devoted Teddy fans. And they're not the ones this movie is made for. The magic of Teddy Ruxpin was never about him being transported to our world. It was in us losing ourselves in his. There's actually a case to be made that a movie centered around a young Ken Forsey discovering the land of Grundo is far more engaging than what we have here. It would also do a great deal more to highlight the Teddy Ruxpin brand, the world, and the many characters that inhabit it. Instead, we'll get jokes about a talking bear making saccharine observations to scruffy bikers in a dive bar, being overwhelmed by the deafening roars of a monster truck rally, and disgusted by the vulgarity at a rap concert. These are not what actual fans of Teddy Ruxpin want to see. It's just what Hollywood is conditioned to produce. It's cheap, it's easy, and it's the kind of lowest common denominator fare that has made jokes out of some of the most beloved franchises. I'm sure DJ2 would love some version of this movie where Ken Forsey's children are in a heated car chase being pursued by a gang of unruly motorcyclists while Teddy is in the back seat making flagrant comments about how this would never happen in Grundo. But we've seen that already. And worse, we've forgotten it. This is intended to be a movie like Paddington 2 or Christopher Robin or Sonic the Hedgehog. But there's a glaring problem in that logic. Teddy Ruxpin is not any of those characters. I'm reminded of the story former president of Alchemy 2 Mary Becker told us in the making of the docuseries. When Ken presented the team with a prototype of a talking teddy bear, the initial proposal was that it would tell generic stories like fairy tales and nursery rhymes. But realizing the technology would soon be reverse engineered and copied by every major toy manufacturer, the team at Alchemy posed one important question. What makes our bear special? It was only then that Ken Forsey brought out the long-dormant Teddy Ruxpin character and imbued their talking toy phenomenon with stories you couldn't get anywhere else. Within just a few years, talking toys became passé, even commonplace. But none were as successful as Teddy Ruxpin. Why? Because people remembered the stories and the characters long after the servo motors in the doll seized up and the cassette player stopped spinning. Even after the batteries had corroded, children who grew up with these stories could still vividly picture King Nogbert's castle, Gimmick's Valley, and the Mushroom Forest. Forcing Teddy to conform to a formula simply because it's easy robs him of everything that makes Teddy Ruxpin unique. If I wanted another Paddington movie, I'd make another Paddington movie. Winnie the Pooh has been done and will continue to be done as long as Disney sees an audience for it. But to assume that Teddy Ruxpin is some one-dimensional archetype that fits neatly into any pre-existing box is ignorant of all the work and imagination that Ken and his team used to bring him to life. For all their supposed admiration of Ken and his creation, the writers clearly have no idea what made any of these characters special. And rather than become familiar with the brand, the world, or the lore, they've sterilized the entire land of Grundo into something that can be shoehorned into a cheap, monotonous, lazy serving of Hollywood slop. I want to support this project. I want to be excited. But instead, I'm left with a sickening feeling in the pit of my stomach. For each moment where we are promised that this will be Teddy's return to mainstream prominence, we are again reminded that nobody with the resources to make that happen has any idea what made him successful to begin with. I can only hope that anything Amazon dreams up for Teddy is a woolly what's-it-sized leap above anything in this pitch deck. But it's just as likely to be as disappointing as a dried-up Rainbow Falls.